Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's episode is actually going to be a conglomeration of the entire Tartaria in the News series that we've been showing over the past week. So this is going to be quite a long one. It's going to be every single episode put together into one giant episode. So I hope you enjoy it. We're going to be here for a while, and if you make it to the end, give yourself a pat on the back. Before we begin, just like to say thank you to all the supporters and all the subscribers, but in particular all the supporters, because you guys really help keep the wheels turning. If you don't support the channel and you'd like to, there are many ways you can, and if you can't afford to, then that's fine. Just make sure you drop a like and a comment, because that really helps me in the fight against the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, we'll commence with this series, the Tartaria in the News. We find out quite a lot of interesting stuff through the entire series, so you don't want to miss any of it. So I'll see you on the other side, and I hope you have fun. So, well, first I'll show you how I've done this. So most of these ones here that all come with the links, they are the American articles. So the way that I've done this, which you can yourself, you can go to the Library of Congress, find the archives for newspapers, and then you just search for a term. So Tartary, Tartaria, stuff like that. Anything that you think will help you find a relevant article that you'd like to research. That's what we've done here. We do have some other articles that come from other places, because unfortunately, the way the British have done this is they allowed a private company to do all of this, who now charges money for you to view these articles. So you can search the archives, but you can't actually view the archives. If you sign up, you can have 3 free articles to view, which is some of the ones you're seeing here. I used my 3 free views to get us a couple of them, but unfortunately there was no point linking them, because can't view them again, because that's unfortunately the way that society's been built. They don't want the poors having access to the information. They genuinely don't want average everyday people having access to our history. The news is a brilliant way of not necessarily viewing true history, but viewing the way in which history was being presented to the people of the time. It shows us the kind of information that they were being presented in those days, which is important to build a narrative. The first thing we'll do is we'll scroll up to focus on the Tartarian language, and that's important. So this one here, again, I haven't included the link, but I have included where it's from. So this is the Northeastern Daily Gazette from Middlesbrough, on the 4th of August, 1891, it was a Tuesday. It's the same information that we've seen in other articles, like this one here. I included this one just because it was a much clearer version of what we've seen here. So it's the exact same text, see? And what does it say? The Abyssinian alphabet consists of 208 characters, each of which is written distinctly and separately. The Sandwich Islands alphabet has but 12 letters. The Burmese, 19. Italian 20, Bengalese 21, Hebrew, Syrian, Chaldee and Samaritan 22 each, Greek 24, Latin 25, German, Dutch and English 26 each, Spanish and Slavonic 27 each, Arabian 28, Persian and Coptic 32, Georgian 35, Armenian 38, Russian 41, Old Muscovite 43, Sanskrit and other Oriental alphabets have 50 each. Ethiopian and Tartarian each have 202. So, when you consider the notion that Tartaria was just a name for a stretch of land, that's interesting, isn't it? That they had an alphabet. We will see another use here. I won't read this whole article, but it's another use of the Tartarian language. This article talks about the Tartarian nations on the banks being subdued by Russians who are invading, and the Chinese as well, who were invading from the other direction. So if we imagine 2 empires swallowing up the country of Tartary, which was, I believe, we're looking at more the Siberian portion or Chinese area of Tartary, towards Siberia, kind of Manchuria, that region. Now this talks about a treaty between, presumably, the Chinese and the Russian to divide the land between them. And it says, this present treaty with all its articles shall be engraven in the Tartarian, Chinese, Russian, and Latin languages upon stone, which shall be placed at the bounds settled between the two empires, there to remain as a perpetual monument of the good understanding that ought to subsist between them. So this is basically talking about the way that Tartaria, or this section of Tartaria, has been swallowed up into Russia and also into China, and they've met in the middle, and they've said, right, let's be civil about this. You have that bit, I'll have this bit, and then we're all good to go. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about that in the later articles. But we're going to continue again now with more about the language. So this comes from the Washington Union on a Tuesday, February 13th, 1849, on page 3. So that's how specific some of these things be. And it talks about Madame Anna Bishop, which is someone you can look up for yourself. She exists, although or she did exist, I should say, not around anymore. But you won't find many mentions of her singing in Tartarian, except for this, which says, Madame Anna Bishop, encouraged by the great success attending her previous concerts and by desire of many families and musical amateurs, will have the honour of giving her second and last grand musical festival at Carusi's Saloon on Wednesday evening. So we'll jump down to further in the text where it talks about what it is. It says the entertainment will commence with her celebrated musical fantastical scenes of circumstance entitled La Sfogato, I think that is. I'm sure you can correct me. It's about Madame Anna Bishop sustaining 7 distinct characters in appropriate costume and singing in 6 different languages: Russian, German, English, French, Tartarian, and Italian. So, once again, not only is Tartarian a language, but it's being sang by Madame Anna Bishop. So I've just done a quick Google for us. Anna Lady Bishop was an English operatic soprano. She sang in many countries and was believed to be the most widely travelled singer of the 19th century. She was married to the composer Henry Bishop, but abandoned him for the French harpist, composer, and entrepreneur Nicholas Charles Boxer. So this is our person. She sings in Tartarian. Ooh, quite a looker, if I may say so myself. We British are a beautiful species. If we come back to our article, we can see that Mr. Boxer, harpist to the Queen of England and formerly director of Her Majesty's Italian Opera House, London, and of the San Carlo, Naples, will perform on the harp with double action and metallic basses, 3 of his most favourite pieces. So that's our boy that she went on to abscond with, which is very interesting. So these people are real, and she was singing on Tartarian. Her lovely boyfriend was on the harp, who was the harpist to the Queen of England. So this next one here is actually very awkward to read in this format, so I've got it up separately and I will read it to you, but unfortunately it's probably going to hurt your eyes if you try. It's hurting mine to try screen. But this comes from General Observations on the Tartarian Nations, the Universal Magazine of Knowledge and Pleasure, from it's volume 91, August 1792. Okay, so I'm going to read this for you as best as I can. It's really difficult, but it says, the Russians, not many hundred years ago, were in the same state as the Tartars now are. And even after they settled in the country of Muscovy, they continued under bondage to the Tartar nations, who surrounded them upon all sides. The Tsar Ivan Vasilievich I released his people from this degrading situation, and his successor, Ivan Vasilievich II, effectually rooted out those freebooters and overawed them in their turn. From this period, the Russian monarchs extended their conquests, and by a rapid progress, the vast regions from the banks of the Dnieper, so the Dnieper, to the Kamchatka, which views from its shores the American mountains, a space of 4,000 miles, acknowledged their sceptre. The most northerly parts of Siberia are inhabited by Finns and Tartar tribes in the lowest state of civilization. The southern provinces border upon Tartary, properly so called. There are many of the Tartars still independent, if we call by that name the liberty of running from the protection of one sovereign to that of another. The Russian government give them every encouragement to settle in Siberia and in the kingdoms of Kazan and Astrakhan, and the Tartars begin to show a disposition to become husbandmen. The Kalmuk hordes are the most obstinate, and they dwell near the Volga, and maintain themselves by fishing, and with their flocks and herds they refuse the name of Tartars, because the word signifies a vagrant. The Kalmuks are esteemed by the other tribes as a superior class. The Kyrgyz are much inferior in character, as well as in wealth, yet I could not help looking with veneration upon our Scythian fathers, though in rags. The Kalmuks deny them. The Kyrgyz, Baskirs, and other Tartars deny the Finns. The Finns detest the Laplanders, and the Laplanders, buried in their earthen caves, esteem themselves of divine origin. This is the best ridicule of family pride and connections that I have met with. The Finns are quiet and industrious, and consequently superior, in some respects, to all the others. But, say the Kalmuks, they are farmers, they till the ground, they are clowns. We are huntsmen and warriors, the immediate descendants of Zingis Khan and Tamerlane, conquerors of India and China. The Tartars are at this day divided into 4 grand divisions. The first inhabit their native plains of Tartary under their Khans. The second are mixed with the Chinese under the same government of laws. The third, having submitted to the government of Russia or to its protection, dwell in Siberia and upon the banks of the Volga. And unfortunately, it goes on to speak of the fourth, but we don't have that second page. We don't have access to that second page. I will try, and if you could get hold of that and you want to post the link to the second page, we can continue reading. So this one is from the Epitome of Opinion in the Morning Journals, from the 8th of March 1877 in the Pall Mall Gazette, London. So this says, Correspondence, the Chances of Peace. To the Editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. Sir, I dare say you are as weary as I am of the forecasts that are daily made as to the chances of a peace between Russia and Turkey. Every day, after reading the latest news from Paris, St. Petersburg, Belgrade, Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, after weighing it all in my mind and successfully forgetting all I have read the day before, I find that I am in one respect as wise as Socrates, for I know nothing, and I know that I know nothing. A passage that I have just come across in Burnet's History of his own time shows, however, that the bench of bishops is greatly to blame for the uncertainty that prevails. Had they been as learned as bishops used to be when they did not spend their whole time in consecrations and confirmations, but when each one thought his own study no unimportant part of his diocese, we might have foreseen with great accuracy the course of events. Burnet had been describing the war between the Grand Signior and the Tartarians against the Emperor and the Tsar and the Venetians. Why, by the way, do we no longer talk of the Grand Signior, and why have the Tartarians become mere Tartars? I will add a curious observation that, though it may seem to be out of the laws of history, yet, considering my profession, will I hope be forgiven, Dr. Lloyd, the present most learned Bishop of Worcester, who has now for above 20 years been studying the Revelations with an amazing diligence and exactness, had long before this year said the peace between the Turks and the papal Christians was certainly to be made in the year 1698, which he made out thus. The 4 angels mentioned in the 14th chapter of the Revelation, or Revelations, that were bound in the river Euphrates, which he expounds to be the captains of the Turkish forces that till then were subject to the Sultan of Babylon, were to be loosed or freed from that yoke and to set up for themselves. And these were prepared to slay the third part of men for an hour, a day, a month, and a year. He reckons the year in St. John is the Julian year of 365 days. That is, in the prophetic style, each day a year. A month is 30 of these days, and a day makes 1, which added to the former number makes 396. Now he proves from historians that Ottomans came and began his conquest, or Ottomans, sorry, but the Ottomans are named after, came and began his conquest at Praus in the year 1302, to which the former number being added, it must end in 1698. After this, he thinks their time of hurting the papal Christians is at an end. They may indeed still do mischief to the Muscovites or persecute their own Christian subjects, but they can do no hurt to the Papalans. And he is so positive in this that he consents that all his schemes should be laid aside if the Turk engages in a new war with them. So, two interesting things to talk about here. Why the Tartarians become mere Tartars? Why did that happen? So he talks about this war between the Grand Signior and the Tartarians against, so the Grand Signior presumably with the Tartarians, against the Emperor and the Tsar and the Venetians. I find that really interesting, that the Venetians were seeing a war off in Russia and they were like, hey, don't forget us. But the other thing this person asks is why, by the way, do we no longer talk of the Grand Signior? And why have the Tartarians become mere Tartars? So we found this picture and it says the habit of the Grand Signior or Emperor of the Turks, 1700. We know that the Emperor of the Turks was called the Grand Signior, and he was fighting with the Tartarians against the Tsar and the Emperor. Mustafa II, by official record, was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1695 to 1703. So was this guy possibly the Grand Signior that we were talking about there? The Sultan Mustafa II dressed in full armour. Is this the Grand Signior? And he was fighting, as we know, with the Tartarians. So, why were the Venetians there? Another question. But the other thing to talk about is this, which is a little off topic, but I did include it because it was part of this article, and it speaks about, apparently, it seems to have been kind of, a topic that people talked about in 1877, that revelations had already happened. It happened in 1698, or at least the peace between the Turks and the Papal Christians happened based upon the fact that they believed that the captains of the Turkish forces were actually the four angels that were bound in the river Euphrates in Revelations. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we have heard from quite a few people that believe that Revelations has already happened. The idea that it's something that's going to happen is wrong. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Does Revelations refer to a war that happened in the 1600s? I think Anatoly Fomenko says that it does. David Ewing Jr. would probably say something similar. But that's interesting, isn't it? What do you think about that? One of these British ones, which you have to pay for, unfortunately. That is the link if you wanted to actually find it. So you will be able to at least verify that the word Tartarian appears in this article. But aside from that, this is talking about the Mughal Empire. Now, the Mughal Empire is the Indian Empire, which was eventually taken over essentially by the British. The Mughal Empire, which had been broken into many kingdoms in the beginning of the 18th century, was founded by Tamerlane, a Tartarian prince who was born in the once famous city of Samarkand and who deservedly won the title of Great. So if you remember my video, Tamerlane the Great Tartar. But the title Mughal was first given to India by Genghis Khan, who, like Tamerlane the Great, was also a native of Tartary. Genghis made his appearance in the beginning of the 13th century and Tamerlane towards the close of the same century. The fact that they're saying he was born at the end or the close of the same century, and we have him actually being born 35 years into the next century, that sometimes, though, that can be based on a very easily explainable thing that some people used to base when Jesus' incarnation happened on when he was crucified and subsequently resurrected, whereas others based the age of Jesus Christ from his birth. But that just talks about the Mughal Empire being founded by Tamerlane. Now, obviously, his children carried on, or say descendants, possibly not just children, but his descendants carried on ruling the Mughal Empire for, hundreds of years. So the Indians weren't even in control of their own country. This is a letter from Baron von Humboldt, read in the French Academy of Sciences, and he gives an account of his visit to the rich mines in the Ural Mountains. And further down here, A bit of text. It says, "Thence he crossed the Kyrgyz, stepped along the frontiers of Chinese Tartary, and visited the ruins of the ancient city of Bulgaride, or Bulgari, formerly the capital city of the Tartary Empire, and the residence of the family of Tamerlane." Now, isn't that interesting? Because we're told that Tartary was just the name for a tract of land, but here in 1830, in Richmond, Virginia, and they're talking about Bulgari or Bulgaride being the former capital of the Tartarian Empire, and that's on the frontiers of Chinese Tartary. Notice the Bulgari, Bulgaride, the connection there to the Bulgarians, the kingdom of Bulgar, the Bulgarians, all coming together now, isn't it? This is a key to slang, which comes from the Seattle Republican, I believe in 1915. Have a look just to make sure. It's actually 1907. So, 1907, this article, a key to slang. And it's talking about different slangs that you can hear across the world and where they came from. Obviously, the key. So, to give the cold shoulder is a brick. And down here we find catching a tartar. Now this one, I've seen this in another article. I can't remember where. It was in somebody's video before I actually made my own videos. They had a similar thing up, a similar article. It probably was a copy of this article, except the person had changed tartar to mean a thief. And it changed the war between Russia and Tartary to being a war between the Irish in the east. It was just a war that the Irish were fighting in the east. It doesn't specify where, just the east of wherever. And during that battle, they caught a Tartar, which it says is a thief. And it was like, that's where that comes from. It just means to catch a thief. And I used to think, that doesn't sound right, does it? You know, in the middle of a battle, a thief, just like, you know what? I think I'm going to risk getting my feet blown off to go and nick a dude's watch. And it just, you know, it didn't seem very likely. And it turns out I was right, because the original is catching a Tartar. During the war between Russia and Tartary, a private soldier shouted, "Captain, I have caught a Tartar." "Well, bring him in," the captain rejoined. "He won't let me," the soldier called despairingly, as his prisoner dragged him into the Tartar lines. You got to remember as well, Tartars were described as being kind of like Maori folk. Very big, tattooed, scary. You know, they would drag you into their lines. But that just shows a war between Russia and Tartary. So if Tartary or Tartaria was just a name for a stretch of land, it was just a name, then maybe somebody should tell the Russians that they were having a war with just a name. And it, you know, it just doesn't really make sense. So that there is a bit more evidence for a war between Russia and Tartary. We've seen evidence of a Tartary empire. We've seen evidence of the Moguls being descended from Tamerlane, which we knew already. But we've also seen people questioning why Tartarians became mere Tartars, why nobody talks about the Grand Seigneur and the war between them and the Emperor and the Tsar, presumably of the Russian Empire, and also the Venetians who were fighting with them. Interesting. We saw the possibility that the four angels mentioned in Revelations were actually referencing four captains of Turkish forces that were subject to a sultan, who was then freed to go on a bit of a massacring rampage before peace was settled between them and the Christians, insinuating that Revelations has actually already taken place. That'd kind of suck, wouldn't it, to find out that we didn't get raptured and we're just still here. But yeah, and then we also learned a bit about the empire and the way that the Russians have taken over these areas. We learned about the Finns in Siberia and everything. It's been really interesting. So quite a good view. And don't forget the language as well. Yeah, we did all the language. We looked. So we know there's a language. We know there was an empire. We know they had wars. Pretty hard to deny at this point, isn't it? So this is just a small excerpt. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to go to the full article for this. So we've come now to the Library of Congress, where we're going to have a look at the full article, which is from 1878, as you can see here. And the article is down here. Now, this article itself appears in many newspapers. This isn't the only one. It's just usually when an article appears so many times like this, I'll just take one of the links and post that to have a look at. There's no point going through all the others. In fact, most of my research doing this was going through copies. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of mentions of Tartary and stuff like that, and most of them are just replicas of the same article posted to a different newspaper. It's just the same information being regurgitated, really. So we're going to look at this, and this is a tattooed man. So a very strange person is now visiting Rome, where he creates a good deal of excitement in scientific circles. This is nothing less than a tattooed man named George Constantinos, a Greek by birth, 48 years old, and of a massive Herculean frame. 14 years ago, he, with two others, a Spaniard and an American, were taken prisoners of war in Chinese Tartary, and all three subjected to this fearful torture to which the Spaniard alone succumbed. The description this man gives of his sufferings is almost too horrible for belief, and it is difficult to find a reason for the selection of this mode of punishment, demanding such a profusion of skill and wearisome labour, but the victim is of the opinion that the natives, who are extremely jealous of their independence, wish to have in all who escaped living witnesses of the danger to which those exposed themselves who dared to make war upon them. 4 hours every day, for 4 months, he was visited by an artist of the country, who, while the prisoner was firmly held down by 3 men, with a sharp lancet dipped in Indian ink, executed all manner of designs upon his skin. In this way, the whole surface of his body was covered with hieroglyphics, Burman characters, figures of men, women, elephants, monkeys, crocodiles, tigers, plants, birds, etc. In fact, a complete illustration of natural history seems to be represented on him, and all with a fineness of execution and profusion of design hard to imagine. 4 years since he managed to escape from his enemies, and since then he has been travelling in Europe wherever he goes, being the subject of curious study to medical men. So that is incredible. It's talking about a war in Chinese Tartary, where a Greek, a Spaniard, and an American all were taken prisoners of war. So what kind of army was fighting in Chinese Tartary that would have had a Greek, a Spaniard, and an American all fighting together and all being captured together? Is this article simply propaganda to make the Tartarians of the Chinese area seem like barbarians, or is this real? It is known that the Tartarians in those regions did tattoo themselves like the Maori folk, so perhaps that's something. So our next article comes from about 1877, and it talks of war being declared. We'll go to the whole article here, which talks much of the Russians advancing, but we won't be reading the whole thing. But if you want to, you can do. The link's quite a long one, but you'll be able to find it if you do a bit of research, not very hard. But down here, the information that we want to focus on is right here. And it says, "But this letter made no alteration in the resolutions taken at the port, which soon after, by the influence of the new Grand Vizier and the Sham of Tartary, declared war with his Tsarish Majesty. In the month of March 1711, the Grand Vizier, having made the necessary dispositions for the campaign, went out of Constantinople to put himself at the head of the Ottoman army, which was assembled at Adrianople, from whence he caused them to decamp and take the route of the Danube. The Tsar's minister being imprisoned and his courtiers stopped on the frontiers of Turkey, he could not be informed of what was done at Constantinople, but learned so much by other hands as to be able to give orders to be in the field before the Turks. He likewise prepared for the defence of Azop, whither he sent Vice-Admiral Vanderkrus with 300 good sea officers, and leaving to Prince Mensikov the command of his, I can't tell what that actually says, by sea and land in Livonia, Lugria and Fruland. He set out himself from St. Petersburg to Moscow, that he might the more readily attend the new levies and dispatch a numerous army into the Ukraine." So obviously 1711, the English has a little bit difficult to follow, but this talks of the Sham of Tartary and the Grand Vizier declaring war with his Tsarish Majesty. in 1711. So, because it's talking about 1710 up here, 1711, and also interestingly talking about the Ottoman army and the Grand Vizier setting out from Constantinople. So our next article that we come to is from the Lewistown Gazette from 1852, and it's another article that has appeared in many different newspapers. I think I might have even seen this in a British newspaper before, but these are obviously all American, Library of Congress, and this is called Mazeppa, or the Wild Horse of Tartary. So it says, taken from a popular poem of Lord Byron and reproduced and adapted for the Circle with a most attentive and careful exhibition of the powerful situation so graphically described in the great poetic legend. The music and overture directed by R. Willis, the varied and splendid costumes by Miss Rivers, every description of imitative decorations appearing to Poland and Tartary by Fixer. So obviously Tartary is just a name for a stretch of land, as is Poland. You know, definitely not real countries. Mazeppa under the name of Kazina, afterwards King of Tartary. Remember, it's just a stretch of land. It definitely didn't have a king. So it says, the grand procession of horse and foot and complimentary tournament unlocked for entrance of the unknown knight. His subsequent escape and speedy detection, his mystery solved, for Mazeppa boldly avows his purpose in attacking the Count under the guise of the Black Knight. The Castellan pronounces terrible and awful doom upon Mazeppa, to meet which he is forcibly bound to a mad Tartarian steed, whose fury is increased to desperation. He is launched onwards by the exasperated horse amid the darkness of the night and the yells of his incensed enemies. Mazeppa finds a father, a conspiracy is defeated, the father preserved from the assassin's blade. Mazeppa wears the diadem of Tartary, directs a grand war movement towards the enemy, the grand romantic spectacle with a magnificent living equestrian statue upon a moving pedestal, supported upon the shoulders of a troop of Tartars. So this is clearly based, this poem is based on some kind of true story that's happened in Tartary, evidently with Mazeppa saving his father from the assassin's blade, wearing the diadem of Tartary and presumably becoming the king of Tartary, as it seems to suggest up here. You know, and under the name of Kazanir, so presumably that would translate to the city of Kazan, obviously in modern-day Russia, in the province of Tatarstan. Quite the interesting story. A mad Tartarian steed. There are Tartars. He wears the diadem of Tartary. So I've brought us over to Wikipedia to actually have a look at the Mazeppa poem. A narrative poem written by the English romantic poet Lord Byron in 1819. It is based on a popular legend about the early life of Ivan Mazeppa, who later became Hetman of Ukraine. So this is the king of Tartary, according to the legend of the poem. But unfortunately, we probably won't find Wikipedia calling him that. He was just known as the Hetman of the Zaporizhian host, related to the Cossacks. So just like the Crimean Khanate, this is a Cossack Hetmanate. It's nice to see that we have real people that these poems are based on. I wonder what Wikipedia has to say about Tartary. Would you believe it that in the entire Wikipedia article there is not one mention of the word Tartar, Tartary, or Tartarian? Isn't that strange, considering the name was Mazeppa, or the Wild Horse of Tartary, and he was the eventual king of Tartary, and the horse was a mad Tartarian steed, and he wears the diadem of Tartary, yet somehow doesn't even come up. Interestingly though, I have found that they made a little short in 1910. Mazeppa, the infant son of a Tartar chief, was captured by the Poles and grew into manhood in the Polish land, never knowing his true parentage. Mazeppa, or the Wild Horse of Tartary. We might have to find this, won't we? Go and watch the movie. I don't know if I'm that interested. So here is the whole synopsis. Through his bravery and gallantry, he became the favourite page of Olinska, daughter of Castellan, a Polish noble. Mazeppa was the favourite of all women and the envy of all men. He loved Olinska and his love was returned, but this was against the plan of Castellan, who had made preparations to marry her to Count Prenislas. Mazeppa forced a duel with his rival in which the latter was seriously wounded, and the enraged Castellan, as a punishment to Mazeppa, had him tied to the back of a wild and desperate horse in spite of the pitiful entreaties of Olinska. The helpless Mazeppa was driven through the forests and rivers, attacked by wolves, drenched by the rain, then scorched by the sun, with the ropes that bound him buried deep into his flesh, longing for death. He reached the Tartar camp, where the exhausted horse at last dropped. Mazeppa was discovered and relieved from his tortures by kind hands, and by means of a mark on his breast was recognized by the Tartar chief as his son. Mazeppa was proclaimed the successor to his father as chief of the Tartars. However, his greatest hope, that of making Olenska his wife, was worth more to him than all else. Disguised as peasants, he, with several of his followers, entered the house of Castellan, where they were engaged to dance at the festivities of Olenska's marriage, which was about to take place at her father's command. At the opportune moment, the Tartars overpowered the house of Castellan and released Olenska, once more reunited, now for all time, with her Tartar lover, Mazeppa. Replace the word Tartar with Tartarian, and that's the, that's the true synopsis. As that person said in our last video, why have the Tartarians become mere Tartars? The New York Public Library digital collections, we've also got a picture here, which was created between 1850 and 1950, very helpful. But as you can see, the wild horse of Tartary. And you can even buy a paperback copy of the book. So how the hell does Wikipedia not mention the word Tartary? Ridiculous, isn't it? Our next article is from the Daily Madisonian from 1842, and this is quite a long article, so we won't be reading the whole thing because it's about this guy, General Harlan, that they are happy to announce that General Harlan is preparing for the press a narrative of his residence and travels in Asia, and it goes on about his 18 years among the pagan and Mahometan countries of the East. So in this article, we have mentions of Tartary here, and I believe again down here. So we'll have a look at these mentions of Tartary. But it says, the year subsequent to this victory, he was dispatched by the Prince of Kabul on a military expedition into Tartary to make war upon the Prince of Kunduz, with whom Muhammad had long been at variance. So obviously here's one mention of Tartary to make war upon the prince. Now, Kunduz is today in Afghanistan. It's the 7th largest city, and you can see its location here on the map, and we'll show on a map of Asia. So here is all independent Tartary, if you remember, when we've seen it on the maps, and Kunduz right at the bottom, because obviously the Tartarian Empire did take over all these bits, and they even controlled the Mughals of India before the British eventually managed to take over that and even into Afghanistan. And if you remember, the Russians moved south, but we will see more articles that will talk about that, so I won't spoil the fun. The next mention of Tartary here comes after they speak of taking the fortress of Saikun, herefore to acknowledge the impregnable defense of the Uzbek frontier, made a strong impression on Muhammad Refi Beg, and set before his ambition a splendid perspective of conquest, dominion, and glory. The political convulsions that suddenly ensued in consequence of the invasion of Afghanistan by the English, the deposition of Dost Muhammad, who fled into Tartary and fruitlessly endeavoured to excite a religious war among the Uzbeks against the English. This obviously talks about just what I was referencing, the English taking over Afghanistan. So this is referring to what's known as the First Anglo-Afghan War, which took place between 1838 to 1842. That matches the date on our article, which was supposedly 1842. So we can assume that that is exactly what they're talking about there. But once again, we probably won't have much mention of the word Tartary. It would seem not. It is worth noting that this result was actually eventually an Afghan victory, with Dost Muhammad Khan reinstalled to the throne of Kabul. Now, Dost Muhammad Khan, we just saw his name listed there. The deposition of Dost Muhammad, who fled into Tartary and fruitlessly endeavoured to excite a religious war among the Uzbeks. Now, coming to his information, it says that Dost Muhammad Khan was exiled to Mussoorie. So we can see that Mussoorie is located in Uttarakhand, India. Interesting that this was being called Tartary, because it said he fled to Tartary, didn't it? Whereas this is evidently India. I think it's also worth noting that some many years later, Dost Muhammad actually reversed his former policy and signed an offensive and defensive alliance with the British government and eventually had a couple of wars with them, including during the Indian Rebellion of 1857 when the Indians were attempting to rebel against the British. So what's really going on here? Something's being hidden, isn't it? So obviously, looking at this map here, we can see where British India is. And this guy, Dost Muhammad, is supposed to have been exiled to Mysore, right? So if we have a look, Mysore is right here. There's Nepal, and this is Great King. So Mysore would have been in British Indian control. So the guy fled from the British to be exiled in British lands. That doesn't really make sense, does it? We also know that from here, it said that he endeavoured to excite a religious war among the Uzbeks. Well, Uzbekistan, which is part of independent Tartary, is right here. So it seems much more likely that this man has actually fled north into Tartary rather than been exiled to Mysore. So when Wikipedia tells us that Dost Muhammad Khan was exiled to Mysore, that doesn't really make sense, considering Mysore was under British control right there. So, and how was he supposed to incite a religious war among the Uzbeks? By going in the wrong direction. So this just shows how they've altered history. Now, our next article comes from 1870 in the Kenosha Telegraph. And it's down here that we have a mention of Tartary again, from an article entitled, How the Chinese Came to Wear Pigtails. It is curious how the Chinese came to wear pigtails. Several hundred years ago, the inhabitants of China wore their hair as we do. There was war between China and Tartary, and the Chinese got the worst of it and were conquered. When the first Tartar king of the present dynasty came to the throne, he determined to humble the pride of the Chinese. He began in 1644 by ordering everybody to shave off the hair except a tuft on the crown, that being the way he wore his own hair. There were a great many proud and high-spirited gentlemen in China who would not obey the command, and the result was they had their heads chopped off. It is rather an uncomfortable thing for a man to lose his head. The Chinese thought so and concluded to shave and braid their hair into a pigtail, although it was an act of degradation. They felt it keenly, but as the years rolled on, they forgot the humiliation and began to like the fashion. As soon as the pigtails became fashionable, young gentlemen of China tried to get up the longest, neatest, and glossiest tails possible. They cultivated them just as young gentlemen in the United States and almost everywhere else cultivate their whiskers and moustache. Greasing, combing, brushing, and fingering them all the time. That's very interesting. The first Tartar king of the present dynasty, and he began in 1644 ordering them to shave off their hair. The Chinese capital at Beijing was captured by the rebel leader Li Zicheng, and desperate Ming Dynasty officials called on the Manchus for aid. The Manchus took advantage of the opportunity to seize the capital and establish their own dynasty in China. And this is the emperor at the time. This is our Tartar king that supposedly made them change their hairs into pigtails. Hong Taiji. This was our Tartar king. The article's a few years later in 1873, and it's from the Daily Kennebec Journal. And if we come down here in the general news, it's only a very short mention of general news. The Khan and Tartary has seen enough of war and sues for peace. So in 1873, just remember, Tartary, it definitely wasn't a real place. It definitely didn't have a Khan, and it definitely wasn't suing for peace. Our next article is from 1884, and this one talks about the hostilities between France and China. And if we come down here, we see a goodly number of the Celestials. We'll talk about that more at some point. A goodly number of the Celestials are brave and quite skillful warriors, especially the inhabitants of Chinese Tartary. The next article to look at is a few years before. It's from the Daily Gazette, and it's 1877 from Delaware. Now, the piece we want to look at is down here, and it's talking about Russia. It says, Russia has for centuries been a grasping power. Among her territorial acquisitions are the Baltic provinces, Courland, Livonia, Estonia, the islands of the Bosnian Gulf, Finland and Lapland, on altogether 320,000 square miles. All of the once great kingdom of Poland, larger in extent than the Austrian Empire of today, has been absorbed. The Circassians, occupying a country 170,000 square miles in extent, have been rushed by a war of extermination. From Tartary has been acquired the immense territory between the Caspian Sea and the Baikal Lake, equal in extent to Austria, Prussia, France, Spain, and Italy. So as you can see, from Tartary, they have acquired all the land between the Caspian Sea and Baikal Lake. So I've brought us over to Google Maps to have a look at this. This is Lake Baikal, and this is the Caspian. So what this article is claiming is that from Tartary, that they have taken from Tartary all this land between here. So once again, from Tartary has been acquired the immense territory between the Caspian Sea and the Baikal Lake, equal in extent to Austria, Prussia, France, Spain, and Italy. China has yielded the province of Amur-Kienga, larger than the state of Ohio. Prussia, the district of Bialystok, with 184,000 inhabitants. Austria, the province of Galicia, with 400,000 persons. Persia, various districts on the shores of the Caspian, exceeding New England in area. Japan, the island of Saghalien, larger than Sicily and Sardinia put together. And Turkey, the Crimean Peninsula, and other provinces in area 160,000 square miles. Khiva and other countries of Central Asia are occupied by Russian troops and will no doubt be formally annexed in due season. In view of this record, it is not wonderful that Austria and England regard with apprehension the Tsar's attack upon Turkey, and the Turks consider the struggle one for the life of their empire. So Russia was doing bits in 1877, or in the 1800s in general. Russia has taken everything. If we go back to our map, this is what they seized just from Tartary. From China, they'd seized up to the Amur, which the Amur River starts somewhere around here. They'd seized Saghalien here. They'd seized that from the Japanese. They'd taken everything, and obviously they'd taken all this as well from the Siberians a bit earlier. So all this, and down here into the Persian lands, Russia had taken it all. Over here, Crimea and all these areas, Russia had taken that too. Austria, Poland, they weren't safe. They had bits taken. It's absolutely insane. So we're actually moving back in time now, and we've come to 1861. With the Wood County Reporter, which talks how the war ended. The war between the Allied powers, England and France, and China is at an end. The last arrival from Europe reports the restoration of peace, the capture of the city of Pekin, the second greatest in population by the Allies, and the consequent fleeing of the Chinese emperor to Tartary brought the Celestials to their senses and induced them to make overtures of peace, which it appears have been successful, and the fleets of the Allies, having probably received full satisfaction and redress for their grievances, will now return home. I love that they call them the Allies, the super friendship good guy team. That is talking about the invasion in 1861 of China by the Allies, the British and the French, and the Emperor fleeing into Tartary. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the city Pekin is referring to Beijing today. Now for this article, we've come quite a bit forward in time to December 28th, 1978 for the Essex County Herald at the University of Vermont. We're going to have a look down here at this article called How the Banknote Originated. We're not going to be reading all this, although you could if you want, but I'm not going to. We're going to be coming down here to the important information that we're here for. The temptation to create money by the issuing of notes in excessive quantities has long been a characteristic of potentates. In many countries, it was necessary to deprive the ruler of his power to issue money, and the right was bestowed on private institutions. In 1332 AD, the Emperor of Tartary made money of paper and leather to such an extent that gold and silver fell into disuse. At one time, it took 1,000 min, or $15,000, in paper money to buy a cake of rice. This reckless issuing of notes eventually placed the money in such disrepute that in 1686 there was no trace of it left. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? That in 1332, the Emperor of Tartary, he was printing money with paper and leather. The Emperor of Tartary might have been one of the first people to be printing paper money, yet he didn't exist. Our next article brings us back to 1853 in the Camden Weekly from the University of South Carolina, we come down to our mentions. We have a lot of mentions of emperors over here, but what we're coming down for is the emperor and Tartary. Now, this mentions Tartars quite a bit in this article. You can see here, so far as it may establish a more liberal and tolerant government in lieu of the Tartar rule. You can see, it will be remembered that the Chinese proper has been governed by the Tartars from 1642 to the present time, which is what we saw with the Manchus. So that is considered the Tartars, the Manchus, as we know them, the Qing dynasty. They were called in by the emperor of that time to aid him in suppressing a rebellion which was too strong for him. They suppressed the rebellion, and they kindly consented to relieve the emperor of all further dread of such matters by taking the reins of empire into their own hands. The present emperor is the seventh of this Tartar dynasty, and though for probably a century secret societies have existed in China, the object of which was to subvert the Tartar rule, yet this rebellion is the first open attempt for that purpose. Thus far, it has been successful. The rebels have overrun a large portion of the 18 original provinces of China. They are in possession of the most important cities and most of the seacoast. The latest news announces their advance upon Pekin and the flight of the emperor into Tartary. Is this a flight or a withdrawal for the purpose of gathering force from the hordes of the northern Tartars? From this source, the rebellion of 1542 was quelled, and it may again contribute needed strength and courage to the emperor's army. And this article is from 1853. So that's such a coincidence that 7 years later, in 1860, in September of 1860, well, with this article dated 5th of Jan 1861, that when the Allies, the capture of the city of Pekin, the second greatest in population by the Allies, and the consequent fleeing of the Chinese emperor to Tartary brought the Celestials to their senses. So, 7 years later, and the emperor's done the exact same thing and fled to Tartary. I think we're building a narrative here that possibly whenever anything bad happened, the emperor would flee back to Tartary and ask the Tartars to come help him sort it again. Now, this is going to be our final article for today. It's from 1881, the Frostburg Mining Journal, and it just has a mention of Crim Tartary. The article itself is, quite satirical. It's just a writer basically talking about how important the newspapers are. As you can see, in a quarrel with a newspaper, the laugh is against the private citizen. The press asserts for the public the right of eminent domain over individual affairs. If your daughter is to be married, the newspaper calls to count the towels and see the pattern of the spoons. If the emperor of Crim Tartary or the king of the Cannibal Islands arrives, the newspaper takes an inventory of his bedchamber and informs us that he likes his beef rare. Now, this is obviously just mentioning Crim Tartary and the Cannibal Islands as references, but it's very important because as somebody in 1881 reading this newspaper, you would obviously be expected to understand that reference. Having the Emperor of Crim Tartary would obviously imply that everybody in 1881 that was reading this newspaper in Maryland would know what a Crim Tartary was and who the Emperor might have been. Now, what's interesting, if you come to Google and search for the Emperor of Crim Tartary, you'll actually see this, which is called The Rose and the Ring, a satirical work of fantasy fiction, and it's set in the fictional countries of Paphlagonia and Crim Tartary. That really is brazen, isn't it? But you can see here, welcome, History of the Life of Peter I, Emperor of Russia, and you can see the mentions Crim Tartary right there. Amazon for sale, mentions of Crim Tartary. So how the hell they get away with saying set in the fictional countries of Paphlagonia and Crim Tartary? It was a real place. Now, what its official name is the Crimean Khanate. You'll notice the coat of arms includes our Tartarian griffin. So the Crimean Khanate, self-defined as the throne of Crimea and Deshti Kipchak, and in old European historiography and geography known as Little Tartary, was a Crimean Tatar state existing from 1441 to 1783. The longest lived of the Turkic Khanates that succeeded the empire of the Golden Horde. So there you go. You see how this kind of stuff gets the names changed just to hide it a little bit. So if you want to come and look this up, you can even see Crimean Tatar here. Look. And this is how it's been Latinized. But look at the way that they have their own language, their own places. The Lesser Nogay Horde, that you've heard a lot about them if you've watched my channel. So, you should come and read up on this stuff if you're interested. because the Crimean Khanate is obviously the Crimean Empire. Now you can see from this picture here where the area was, Crim Tartaria here. And in other points in history, they take over the sections like this. But this is the Nogays up here, the Nogay horde that controlled all this part of Tartary. And as you can see, these are the Muscovites. So in 1707, the Russians were not very big at all. They were only this section up here. And then they just started spreading, taking over, going east, taking over the Nogay horde areas of Tartaria. And then they moved south, etc., etc., as we've learnt today. So you can see. Look at that. Posted it somewhere. I actually posted it on my channel. So if you go into my community posts, I think I've got the name for that. So if you haven't been watching, this is the series that we've been doing, Tartaria in the News, where we go through all these old articles, like this one here on the Library of Congress, as you can see, November 1861, and we look for mentions of Tartary, or Tartaria, Tartars, etc. So it's quite a grueling long process to go through all these, especially with all the copies that you get, because multiple newspapers obviously being owned by the same people, they would print these same articles in different newspapers all over the country. So a lot of this is just going through the same stuff over and over again. It's quite tedious. But at the end, I was left with a nice little archive of all these articles that I wanted to show you. So now this is our third episode, and we're going to crack on with this. For the people asking about the Discord server, unfortunately it is a members benefit. It was something I set up just to say thank you to my supporters, because I honestly had nothing to offer them. So I thought, well, at least if I have a Discord server, there's somewhere where people can come and talk to me. So unfortunately that is part of the channel membership. So if you join there, or if you join the Patreon, which I actually prefer because I get to keep more of that, but if you do either of that, you can get access to the Discord server, and I really appreciate any help I can get. So very sorry that I can't have it as an open thing, but if I did, I'd have to get moderators and everything, because anybody could join and it would take way too much time out of my day. Thank you to everyone that does support, and if you support the channel and you're not in the Discord server, make sure you get yourself in there. Anyway, back to our articles to see our mentions of Tartary. So this is the Nevada Democrat from November 1861, and it's kept in the University of California, and that's where the image was provided by. Anyway, and we'll scroll down here to have a look at what our mention says. The death of the Emperor of China. By the arrival of the ship N.B. Palmer from Hong Kong, we have intelligence of the death of Hien Feng, the Emperor of China. He died at his palace at Seahole in Tartary on the 22nd of August. He fled to Seahole on the advance of the Allied army upon Pekin in September 1860 and remained there up to the time of his death. It is supposed that the nomination of a successor to the emperor was given in favour of his infant son, who reigns under a regency consisting of a council of 6. This arrangement is unsatisfactory, and the hopes of foreigners rest on Prince Kung, the emperor's brother, who has had charge of the government since the emperor fled to Tartary. Hien Feng succeeded to the throne in 1850 and was but little over 30 years of age at the time of his death. So if you were watching yesterday's episode, you will remember we talked about this. I was correct. It was September of 1860 in which the emperor fled from the Allied forces, the Allied army, which we know from the other article was the British and the French, who were advancing on Pekin. And we also have the name of our emperor. That we didn't have the name last time. So let's go have a look at the Emperor of China, Hien Feng. And here on Wikipedia, we've got Xianfeng Emperor, or by temple name, Emperor Wenzong of Qing, the Qing dynasty. Given name Zizhu, was the 8th emperor of the Qing dynasty and the 7th Qing emperor to rule over China proper. Reigned from 1850 to 1861. During his reign, the Qing dynasty experienced several wars and rebellions, including the Taiping Rebellion, Nian Rebellion, and the Second Opium War, the Arrow War. He was the last Chinese emperor to exercise sole power. After his death, the Qing government came under the control of Empress Dowager Cixi. I'm pronouncing that probably very wrong. But that is our guy. You can see he was, as it told us, only 30 years old at the time of his death. Look at a little baby face. And as it also said, he ruled from 1850 1850. As we see on our article, Hian Feng succeeded to the throne in 1850. Makes sense. He fled to Seoul in 1860, and he has died at his palace at Seoul on the 22nd of August, 1861. So according to Wikipedia, Chengdi Mountain Resort is the place is Seoul, where he retired to and where he died. So this is it. We're going to go have a look on Google Earth and see exactly where that is. So if we have a look here, we can see where he fled to in Tartary, and this is Beijing, Peking. So this is where he went to. Now this, at the time, was clearly considered Tartary. So that, presumably, is over the border. Well, fortunately, we found this map that was drawn in the 1800s, I think, and it shows Peking, which is obviously Beijing. So this is the water there. You can see here to Beijing, and then up here is Seoul, and you can see it's past this border, which obviously is part of Tartary. So this border here is obviously where China finished at that point in 1860, and Seoul was there. So that does match up with what we're told as Chengdi being the region, but obviously now this is just all China. They have taken over pretty much everything. Now the final thing just to look at momentarily before we move on to the next article is the Second Opium War. So the Second Opium War, also known as the Second Anglo-Sino War, the Second China War, the Arrow War, or the Anglo-French Expedition to China. I like how they call it the Expedition to China. Just call it how it is, Lance. It's an invasion. But it was a colonial war lasting from 1856 to 1860, which pitted the British Empire and the French Empire against the Qing dynasty of China. What we learnt last time, the Qing dynasty are the Tartars, the Manchu Tartars that took over in 1644. It was the second major conflict in the Opium Wars, which were fought over the right to import opium to China and resulted in a second defeat for the Qing dynasty and the forced legalization of the opium trade. So we were heroin smugglers. And as we learnt from our articles, in 1860, British and French troops landed near Beijing and fought their way into the city. Peace negotiations quickly broke down, and the British High Commissioner to China ordered the foreign troops to loot and destroy the Imperial Summer Palace, a complex of palaces and gardens at which Qing dynasty emperors handled affairs of state. During and after the Second Opium War, the Qing government was also forced to sign treaties with Russia, such as the Treaty of Aigun and the Convention of Peking. As a result, China ceded more than 1.5 million square kilometers of territory to Russia in its northeast and northwest. With the conclusion of the war, the Qing government was able to concentrate on countering the Taiping Rebellion and maintaining its rule. Among other things, the Convention of Peking ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to the British as part of Hong Kong. Right, we'll move on to the next article because we did spend quite a while looking at that one, but it was interesting, and it's good to see how these things link up to real-world events so you don't get confused. But down here, this article is 1889. It's the Evening Star provided by the Library of Congress in Washington, and this is de Molay's expedition. In the spring of the year 1299, James de Molay, the 22nd and last Grand Master, with a body of French and English knights, landed at Saudia and made a junction with the Tartar forces which were camped among the ruins of Antioch. The Emperor of Tartary was at variance with the Sultan of Egypt and had invited the Templars to join him in an expedition into Palestine. An army of 30,000 men was placed by the Mughal Emperor under the command of de Molay. The Grand Master and the combined forces marched up the valley of the Orontes towards Damascus. In a great battle fought at Homs, the troops of the sultans of Damascus and Egypt were entirely defeated and pursued with great slaughter until nightfall. Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, and all the principal cities surrendered to the victorious arm of the Mughals, and the Templars once again entered Jerusalem in triumph, visited the Holy Sepulchre, and celebrated Easter on Mount Zion. The combined armies were preparing to march upon Damascus when the sudden illness of Kazan, who was given over by his physicians, disconcerted all their arrangements and deprived the Grand Master of his Tartar forces. The Templars were then compelled to retreat to the seacoast and embark their forces on board their galleys. So I think we'll stop that there because this article does seem to go on and on about the Templars. So if you would like to learn more about the Knights Templar, it does seem to be an entire page dedicated to, yeah, the knights of old under the banner of the cross, the battles fought for faith, the order of the temple of its brave warriors. So yeah, if you'd like us to go through this at some time, go through the whole thing, we could do, because that is quite interesting, might have some info in it. But let's talk about this. So it seems the Emperor of Tartary was called Kazan. Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan in Russia, is named after him, presumably. Kazan, which it was called before, Kazan. You know, if you come to this old map, 1736 Europe, you can see Kazan right there. Which obviously, with the S before it was the Z, and it was the C before it was the K. In fact, as I was just looking to try and find our Emperor Kazan, I did see Kazan and Astrakhan here, which is the old name, as I said, Kazan, which obviously will be named after our guy, so I'm going to try and find him. So yeah, further down in this book, we can see the people were once subject to the Tartars, whose Prince Roido in the year 1140 conquered Muscovy. But John I, encouraged by their civil dissensions, denied them tribute. In process of time, when Ametes, the last successor of Roidu, who died at Vilua, had overcome the Tartars, Pracapenses, the great duke, adjoined to his empire Permia, Vestia, and Lugria, provinces subject to Ametes. From this time, the forces of the great duke increasing. Basilius Kazan and John II conquered the provinces of Sitrahan, which at this day are called kingdoms. So there we can see Basilius Kazan. This could possibly be our bloke. We know that John I was around 1140. This is John II, so presumably another 30, 40 years. So this still seems a little bit too soon, but it could be possible. Basilius is actually a Greek term that means king or emperor. So when they've translated that to Basilius Kazan, they've neglected to translate the Basilius Greek into English to mean Emperor Kazan. So right here, when it says Basilius Kazan and John II, it should say King Kazan or Emperor Kazan. But they've left it as the Greek. They've done that on purpose to confuse you. Okay, so I couldn't find the one we're looking for, but I did find an Emperor Kazan, who was Emperor of Japan during 1984 to 1986. So I thought that was quite coincidental, wasn't it? Anyway, we're going to move on because there's not enough time to do the research. We're doing the articles today. If you want me to go back and go more into that, we can do. If you want to tell me more about that, if you know something about Emperor Kazan, then feel free to let me know. Or King Kazan, Khan Kazan, whatever his name would have been, let me know. But it'll definitely be something I'll be investigating later. But for now, we're going to carry on with the Alexandria Gazette from 1821. Towards the end of 1818, the imperial palace at Pekin was involved in a sudden thickest darkness, which lasted 24 hours. It resembled the darkness with which Egypt was visited. No artificial light was able to overcome it. The different attempts made to that effect was as vain as its cause was inscrutable. The most able magicians were consulted, and all confessed their ignorance. If some dared to ascribe it to the enchantments of the Christians, they only by that proved the more clearly their stupid malice. The emperor and his court were, nevertheless, seized with astonishment and terror. In the following year, the emperor died suddenly in Tartary, without having had time to nominate his successor. It also says that Cochin China and Tonquin likewise lost their emperor Gyalong. He died in January 1820. The main things we wanted to focus on was the apparent 24 hours of total darkness, which befell Pekin, Beijing in 1818. And then obviously the death of their emperor, who was in Tartary, in the following year, so 1819 or 1820, something like that. So we're going to have a look now. So our best guess at the emperor will be this guy who died on the 2nd of September 1820, Jiaqing Emperor, the Emperor Renzong of Qing, born Asin Gyoro Yongyan. He was the 6th emperor of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty and the 6th Qing emperor to rule over China proper from 1796 to 1820. He was the 15th son of the Qianlong emperor. During his reign, he prosecuted Heshen, the corrupt Manchu favorite of his father, and attempted to restore order within the Qing Empire while curbing the smuggling of opium into China. He would have not been a fan of the British heroin dealers. Believe it or not, he actually died at the same place as the other emperor that we saw, the one that died in 1861. So, same place in Z-Hole. Now, our next article comes from the Daily Ohio Statesman, and it's from January 4th, 1861. So, shortly after the Chinese emperor had fled into Tartary, and this article itself talks about that, the flight of the emperor of China. So this actually starts off by saying that they give the following details of the place to which the emperor of China has fled. Mukden is not in Tartary, properly so called, but in Manchuria. The country of the Manchus forms part of the interior provinces of the empire and comprises 3 departments. The first is that of Qingqing, having for its chief town Mukden or Fengtian. The second, Gurin, with a chief town of the same name. And the third is Sakarlian, Ula Khoton, with Sakar as its capital. It is in this country of the Manchus that are to be found the most devoted partisans of the Tartar Manchu dynasty, which effected conquest of China in 1644 and still reigns over that vast empire. Manchuria is separated from the province of Pechlili, in which Peking is situated, by that of Laotang. Between the 2 last-named provinces are the high mountains of Thanyen, which are of difficult access and must have protected the retreat of the emperor. Mukden is about 400 kilometers from Peking. If the emperor had retired into Tartary, properly so called, he would have had to make a journey across Mongolia of about 1,000 kilometers and pass through some provinces, the inhabitants of which are completely hostile to him. We may add, in order to explain the English dispatch, that as Hong Kong, Shanghai, and in the ports of the coast inhabited by Europeans, all the Chinese possessions which have been formerly conquered by the Tartars and the Tartar Manchu, such as Mongolia, Manchuria, Dzungaria, Doria, and Chinese Turkestan, are all comprised under the general and usual name of Tartary. Mukden was the residence of the sovereigns of China until 1644, the period of the conquest. It comprises 2 distinct cities, the imperial one, which has a circumference of 4 kilometers and a magnificent palace, and the other, which surrounds the former and is 12 kilometers round and enclosed by a wall, much more considerable than that of Peking. The population of Mukden does not now exceed 500,000. The city contains very fine temples and magnificent buildings of all kinds. So, even though we were told that he actually fled to Zihol, and we have information that he died at the mountain resort there, well, this one tells us that he went to Mukden, which is now Shenyang, and it supposedly had much superior walls and temples and everything to Peking, Beijing. Obviously, we'll look at the map here, and I'll show you on Google Earth, but it's quite easy to see. This is a map of China. It's Shenyang. It's not too far away from the mountain resort. But if we come back to Google Earth, we can actually see how far away it is from where he supposedly fled to and where he ended up. So, I wonder what the difference is there. Because obviously, this is the city where that article claims that he's fled to, whereas we were told that he fled to Zihol. And we also told he died at Zihol. Wonder what's going on there. Was it Shenyang or was it Zihol? But I think what's most likely happened here is they've made it Zihol to pull your attention away from Shenyang, which obviously they were telling us was the capital of Manchuria, and as such was the capital of this entire empire. And this is just an image here of the Mukden Palace. So I don't know if that's the original or if it's a reconstruction, but going back to this article, very interesting what this guy was saying. He's basically saying, this is not Tartary, or properly Tartary, this is Manchuria. The proper Tartary, if he was there, he'd have to travel through Mongolia. And if we come to this 1872 map of the world, we can actually see Mukden right there, Peking here. So what it's saying here is the emperor would have had to jump through Mongolia to this area here, which was the original Tartary. The bits between here and obviously independent Tartary. So this would have been the proper Tartary, and this, Manchuria, was bits that had been captured by the Tartars. So you have to imagine that all this had been taken over by the Tartars over the many, many years. And now Russia and China were slowly starting to take all these lands for themselves. Speaking of which, we come to 1878 with an article talking about China's conquest. So it says, the recent conquest of Kashgar by the Chinese is of immense importance and extends the Chinese border line up to the possessions recently acquired by Russia, and they will henceforth stand side by side in Central Asia. China, after all, is only getting back her own, for she ruled this section of Turkestan for 108 years, until 14 years ago the revolt under the leadership of the famous chieftain Yaqub Beg proved successful. He died a few months ago, and China has now succeeded in regaining possession of these states of independent Tartary, formerly controlled by her. The Chinese, it is thought, were incited to this military activity by the English government, which is, of course, desirous of placing every possible obstacle in the path of Russia's progress towards India. The rebellion against Kashgar, the ruling state of independent Tartary, which succeeded the death of Yaqub Beg, afforded an excellent opportunity for invasion, and an immense Chinese army was immediately sent into the country. But the Orientals would scarcely have been equal to the occasion unless instigated by their more wily and diplomatic English advisors. So once again, Britain causing all the problems. But this time they have incited the Chinese, so don't forget that Britain took over, invaded China and caused the emperor to flee. Only, how many years? 17 years earlier, presumably. It was in 1860, don't forget, and they legalized their heroin trade. So obviously what they've done is they've installed a puppet government, or a government that are sympathetic to the British cause, you know, they're funded by, etc. And now they've been informed that they need to invade independent Tartary and take back these regions. You can see from his Wikipedia, Muhammad Yaqub Beg was a Kokandi ruler of Yetishar, Kashgaria, during his invasion of Xinjiang from 1865 to 1877. He held the title of Atalik Ghazi, Champion Father. And you can see that he was born in the Khanate of Kokand, which we're going to see later when Russia takes over that. And it notes, by the way, that the English were doing this because they want the Chinese to be right up to the border with Russia, because Russia was expanding south. Russia was taking over most of independent Tartary, all the bits near the Caspian Sea, and they were moving straight towards India. And the British were very worried because, as you'll see in later articles, they didn't think they could win. So this next article, we're flying forward in time to 1912, which is 2 years before World War I kicks off, the big event. And we have some mentions here. I think that's the only one. Yep, so we have some mentions here at the top. And it's talking about Russia. The text is extremely faded, but it's called Land Grabbing in Asia. We won't be reading the whole thing because I can barely work out what it says at the bottom, but we'll come to the top to the bits that we're talking about with Chinese Tartary, and we'll see what the Russians have been doing. So it says, it is announced that Mongolia and Chinese Tartary will become independent of China and go under Russia's protection. Russia is also extending a zone of influence over the northern part of Russia. If all these plans are carried out, the Tsar will extend his power over territory greater than that of all of Europe outside of Russia. In Persia, Great Britain is coming up from the south to meet Russia. She is extending her zone of influence northward. It is safe to say that if Russia gets control of Mongolia and Chinese Tartary, Great Britain will take charge of Tibet, in the two regions extending her influence over nearly 1 million miles of territory. While Russia and Great Britain are grabbing Japan will not sit idly by. She will probably assume full control of Manchuria, more populous though not as extensive as Mongolia, as the price of her acquiescence. I found it interesting, the mention of Manchuria, because obviously Japan goes on to invade Manchuria in 1931. And I noticed it was following the Mukden incident, and I never knew that it was called the Mukden incident. I knew about the bombing of the train line, and they call it a false flag event, but how interesting that it actually happened at the Manchurian capital, the Tartarian Manchurian capital. So, all linking up, isn't it? But back to the article, and what it's saying is Mongolia and Chinese Tartary are going under the protection of Russia. So in our last article, we saw that Britain was trying to push their puppet Chinese government to take over more and more lands. Well, it looks like those areas have gone to Russia. Now, this is 2 years before World War I kicks off and Europe goes into an almighty war, and Africa and everything, well, the world. So you can really see how Tartary was getting absorbed right up until the beginning of World War I. So for our next article, we're here with the Juniata Sentinel and Republican in 1896 to see what mentions of Tartary we have. I can see a couple there, but the article is called Ship of the Desert, the Evolution of the Camel and His Uses. So it starts here: as a means of transportation, the camel has been placed in a region where man would have been helpless without him. He was no doubt the first animal domesticated. We read of him as a burden-bearer in Abraham's time, and as constituting the chief wealth of Job, and find him in use now on the Canary Islands, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, the Great Sahara, Egypt, Nubia in Africa, and in Arabia, Persia, Kabul, Beluchistan, Hindustan, Burma, Tibet, Mongolia, southern Siberia, and in independent Tartary in Asia, where he endures severe cold. Also in the Crimea and a limited district around Constantinople. Notice how it's basically all the areas the Tartars have been to. They like to take their camels. We can come up here to the second mention, which says the Bactrian camel is less common and is found chiefly in Tartary and southern Siberia. For reference, this is our Bactrian camel. A beautiful beast.
This Bactrian camel in Shanghai Zoo has just had his daily dose of opium, provided by the British government. Scotty likes himself some heroin.
We have an article here from 1892, which again mentions Tartary. If we come over to this article here, we can see 10 years before my adventure, I had travelled extensively in Khorasan, portions of Afghanistan, and along the southern boundary of independent Tartary as the purchasing agent of a Philadelphia firm of Morocco leather manufacturers. So as we can see in 1892, this guy is still referring to independent Tartary as independent Tartary. We'll have a quick look at that map. So this map is from 1851 and it's of independent Tartary. So we've got Khiva, Kokand, Bokhara. These are all areas that will be mentioned in other articles as the Russians move on. But that's just your reference of where we're looking at the Caspian Sea here. Now this next article is again from 1892, the Eagle River Review provided by Wisconsin Historical Society. And we'll come down here to have a look about independent Tartary. It says the precautions taken by the British and American authorities in the matter of cholera are in strong contrast with the conduct of the French. The first case occurred in France in March, and because the government has been afraid, for reasons of traffic, to admit the existence of the disease, it has gained a foothold that it would not otherwise have done. This terrible pestilence now flourishes in eastern Russia and Europe and northwest Asia among the Tartar and semi-Tartar people, also in Turkey, Persia, and independent Tartary. If it had been taken hold of courageously and wisely by the authorities at Paris, it might have probably been confined within the limits of European Russia. The Russian government has apparently done what it could to prevent its spread, but the ignorant and superstitious population have sturdily resisted all efforts to mitigate the horrors of the disease where it exists or prevent its being scattered abroad. This talks obviously about the Tartar people and semi-Tartar people having a lot of cholera and independent Tartary, unfortunately, and that's in 1892, all because of the French. Although I don't think any of us would be surprised if it turned out it was on purpose. You know, a good way to ruin a nation that's causing you problems is cover it with a disease, right? You know, good old bit of cholera, that'll sort them out. So our next article is from 1880, and it's just a little mention of Tamerlane down here. It says, who was Tamerlane and what was he famous for? Tamerlane was born at Kesh in independent Tartary in 1335. He early gave proof of having great courage and conquered Balkh, the capital of Khorasan. He afterwards subdued Persia and captured Baghdad. Then, marching to India, he entered Delhi, where he took immense treasures. While on this expedition, Baghdad revolted, and he hastened back to that city and put to death thousands of its inhabitants. He then turned his arms against the Turks and took the Emperor Bayezid a prisoner in 1402. He next vanquished Egypt and died February 19th, 1405. Now that has a few mentions of different things we've heard, because we've read 2 books on this channel about Tamerlane, 2 differing books, give very different opinions on his history. One said that he invaded Egypt and the other didn't. It was very clear that he didn't go into Egypt. This has hints of both, because it talks of Egypt, but it doesn't mention China, which the Egyptian one had him invading China. And neither mentions Russia. This will be our final article now. We come to 1879, the New York Herald. And down here at the bottom, we've got some more talk of what's Russia up to. So if we actually see, this is called, it's a very long article, but it's the onward march of Muscovite civilization in Central Asia. New pathways of commerce from the Black Sea to the Caspian, along the Arnu to China. So yeah, very long article, goes into a lot of information about these places, but We're just here for this, Russia's new field of enterprise. And down here, Russia will, in all probability, be left free scope north of the Hindu Kush, and as no other power is likely to interfere with her in completing and perfecting her conquests, it is not unfair to conclude that at no distant day she will be mistress of the whole of that region of Central Asia, which was wont to be designated as Turkestan or independent Tartary. In its widest sense, Tartary embraces the whole central belt of the Asiatic continent, from the Caspian Sea to the shores of the Eastern Ocean. Independent Tartary or Turkestan, before it was encroached upon by Russia, was bounded by the far-reaching territory of that empire on the north, by Afghanistan and Persia on the south, by the Caspian Sea on the west, and by the Chinese frontier on the east. The area embraced was little short of 1 million square miles. Before Russia got its claws into Tartary, it was 1 million square miles. Just to put that into size reference, that's a quarter of the size of Europe. And for the Americans, the United States is 3.5 million square miles. So, this area is 1 million. It's almost a third of the United States in size. It's absolutely humongous. But anyway, I think on that bombshell that was probably dropped by the Russians, we're going to end this video and we'll pick it up tomorrow with the rest of these articles. I think we'll probably get it done tomorrow. There's not that many left. So I hope you're enjoying the videos, hope you're learning something, and tomorrow we'll probably be getting more into the individual areas that Russia takes as it moves forward. I think this article does actually include quite a bit. It does, yeah. You can see they're talking about taking over Khiva. So in 1873, Khiva was taken over. 1875, Kokand was taken over. So articles like this provide you such information. This one, it just talked about an epidemic coming to America, this cholera in America. This article's from 1884. Second epidemic commenced in India in 1826. It was forwarded north through the mountain passes by caravans and traders through Central Asia and independent Tartary to the great trading towns of Orenburg in Russia on the Volga, which it reached in 1829. Thence it passed to Moscow, striking large numbers of Russian soldiers engaged in the Polish War, and then it just talks about it moving through Europe onto London and then boarding ships, as cholera does, and moving on to America. And we're also going to come back to this article from 1879, which we saw at the end of the last video. I said we were going to look at a teeny bit more of this article. So I'm not going to read you the whole thing, I'm going to read the whole thing, and I'm just going to edit out the bits that are boring and give you the good juice. So this first bit just talks about Britain moving north through Asia via India and the Russians moving south via independent Tartary, the Khanates, and how these two colossal powers are going to meet in the middle and obviously have some kind of deadly collision with a battle for supremacy. So for those that don't know, as this goes in talking about the opinions may differ as to the right of England to Hindustan and the right of Russia to Turkestan. Those who don't know, obviously Turkestan is independent Tartary. Turkestan is the name that was given to it by the invaders, and Hindustan is the Mughal Empire, or the Mughal Empire. There's different names, but Mughal Empire was set up by Tamerlane when the Tartarians captured India in the 14th century, and they remained in power all the way until 1857, when the British finally subdued them and took full command of India. This section of the article just talks about how brilliant the British government of India is and how the Russians wish to do the same thing in northern and central Asia. The next part of the article just talks about how they wish for the two empires to not engage in combat and how they could shake hands and recognize each other as formidable civilizations. This bit starts to talk about how Britain is possibly going to annex or permanently annex the entirety of Afghanistan to British India. As we know, Afghanistan was under Tartarian control for numerous periods throughout its history. With independent Tartary just to the north of it. They always had the Tartars coming south into Afghanistan, taking over those regions. If Herat, Kabul and Kandahar fall, then it'll definitely become the residence of British troops. But if Herat is not occupied by British troops, then it will definitely not be occupied by those of Russia. Ever since 1841, when Herat was saved from the Persians and Russians, mainly through the engineering skill and bravery of young Eldridge Pottinger, the Anglo-Indian has taken a special interest in Herat and its surroundings. So that's very interesting. The engineering skill and bravery of Eldridge Pottinger. So, coming to the Wikipedia, Eldridge Pottinger was an Anglo-Indian army officer and diplomat. Born in Ireland, he became the hero of Herat. So, apparently in 1837, he made a journey through Afghanistan in disguise. Arriving at Herat, he found it threatened by a Persian army and immediately made himself known to the Afghan commander offering his services. With the Persians, there were some Russian officers. The attack, which soon followed, was conducted with vigour, but the defence inspired by Pottinger was ultimately successful, and after a year the siege was lifted. As a British Indian, this guy was moving across Afghanistan in disguise when he saw this city under attack, and he took off his disguise and said, "Hey, mate, I'm actually educated in the way of the artillery." And he conducted a defence for a whole year. Well, that's quite impressive. Don't know if it's true, but he's been listed as a hero of Herat by British historians. The next bit of the article just talks about how Russia will be left to take the area north of the Hindu Kush and all of the area known as independent Tartary or Turkestan. It says that in its widest sense, Tartary embraces the whole central belt of the Asiatic continent from the Caspian Sea to the shores of the Eastern Ocean. So just for reference, for anybody that isn't aware, we're going to use this 1721 map by John Senex to identify some of these places. Obviously, the Eastern Ocean at this point was apparently not yet completely mapped, so they don't have a lot of the coast. They don't know how far it extends. We do have the rest, so we can see down here, Mughal, well over 100 years later, and the British control this. We were talking about the places in Afghanistan here, which are currently under control of Persia at the time of this map, it looks like. And obviously, what that was talking about is Tartary, in its broadest sense, is everywhere, essentially from the Caspian Sea all the way to this Eastern Ocean. Now, if you remember in one of our past videos, in the article that talked about a treaty being made between the Russians and the Chinese and it being set in stone in the languages of Russian, Chinese, Latin and Tartarian, well, this actually references that. It says the plain of Bargu, or Barju, this tract of land was left undecided in the Treaty of Nipchu that was made between the Tsar of Muscovy and the Emperor of China in 1689, and is still possessed by the subjects of Muscovy. So this is the border that they set between the Chinese and the Russian parts of Tartary. So in 1689, after Russia had conquered all this and China had moved up conquering all this. Now, this seems like a bit of a red herring because the Emperor of China in 1689 was a Tartar. They took over in 1644. The dynasty of the Tartars came in, and they came from Chinese and Tartary. They came from up here, they came from north, and they came down, and they took over here. And obviously, Pekin, which is today Beijing, is considered the capital. Well, that just means city of the king. So here was the king or the emperor of China would have been residing here at Pekin. But if we come up here, you'll see it's called Ula here. In other places, it will be Kumbalu or Kumbalich. That just means city of the Sham. The Kumbalich, it's same as Pekin being city of the king, city of the king, city of the Sham. Ula was formerly the seat of the emperor of the Tartars. When this talks about there being a deal between the Chinese emperor and the Tsar of Muscovy in 1689 to be the borders, that's actually a treaty with the Tartars, because the Tartars came down in 1644 from here and took over China and had all this area. So what's actually happened here is as Russia's taken over these areas, they've made a deal with the Tartars to say, don't go any further. You can have that, but we're keeping this. So this is definitely a red herring. But we'll be going much more into that in a future episode. For now, we're going to carry on with these articles. I did go off on a tangent there, but that was an important tangent because you'll learn a lot about that, because you see how they change history. Remember, the Tartars are in control of China when this deal is made. So when it says the Emperor of China, what it really means is the Emperor of the Tartars, because this area was controlled by the same people. Now, this article is just talking about independent Tartary and where it was bordered at the time before Russia encroached on it. So instead of having to read that, I'll just show you a map. And this one is from 1851, and it shows us independent Tartary with all our different regions. You guys might have seen this on the last episode. I've shown it a few times, I think. But Bukhara, Kokand, Khiva, and up here just as Tartaria. But this is independent Tartary. So this is what was left. So Tartaria originally was much more up there. You'll remember another article that we saw that talked about Russia taking essentially the entire land from the Caspian Sea to Lake Baikal from Tartary. So if we just come to Google Earth, you can see that this is our Caspian Sea right here. Caspian Sea, that's the Aral Sea. Here's our Aral. We won't talk about why that looks like that today. This is independent Tartary. And before taking independent Tartary, they took all this area from here to here from Tartary. And then what they've done is they've made a deal here with the Chinese to not go any further. But it wasn't the Chinese, obviously it was the Tartars. If they've taken it from Tartary, they've taken it from the Tartars. On two separate occasions, and during the long reigns of Genghis Khan and Timur Beg, two of the most powerful but also most destructive conquerors who the world has ever known, this whole region of Central Asia enjoyed the advantages of unity, at least such unity as can be brought about and maintained by the strong hand of tyranny. So it talks about it being disconnected into three independent states, which are powerful states, called Khiva, Kokand and Bukhara, as we just saw on the map, and they're called Khanates. The next bit says Khiva and its desert have become popularly known to the present generation in consequence of the War of 1873, so we'll look more into that. I find it interesting that Kokand was otherwise called Kurgana because we have seen a lot of names like Amir Kurgan and stuff like that in books to do with Timur. As we know, second names a lot of the time aren't really second names, and they're actually the name of the place that people have come from. So when you see things like Amir Kurgan, that would usually mean the king of Kurgan. Latterly, however, the rule of Bukhara has been honoured with the title of Emir. So you can see how that easily becomes Amir Kurgan, the name of somebody, instead of Amir Kurgan, the king of Kurgan. So now, with that bit of information, we can go back to our book about Tamerlane and understand a bit better about where these people were coming from or where they're hailing from. So they're from Kurgan or Kokand. So it was the king of Kokand or the Khan of Kokand or the Emir of Kokand. They have done that purposely. They mistranslate things to make people just sound like normal everyday people. You know, oh, this is just Amir Kurgan. Nice to meet you. This bit says Balkh and Kundur, originally the seats of independent Khanates, have in times comparatively recent been subjugated by the Afghan chiefs, and they are now regarded as within the limits of Afghanistan. I wonder if that's British Afghanistan by any chance. So here it claims that in 1873 Khiva was conquered and a large portion of the Khanate was permanently annexed to Russia. In 1875 a similar fate befell Kokand, and the whole region north of the Tartaria forms part of the Russian government of Kurgana. Bukhara has also been compelled to yield to Russian influence, and Samarkand is now to all intents and purposes a Russian city. Samarkand was the seat of Tamerlane, that was his city. The Turkomans have for the present checked Russia's advance, but the check can only be temporary, and it is merely a question of time when Russia shall be completely mistress of the entire region of Central Asia, between the Caspian and the Chinese frontier, and south as far as Afghanistan and the confines of Persia. Later on in the article it says that Kokand has been practically extinguished, Khiva has been conquered and subjected in great part to Russian rule, Bukhara is in a similar condition, and Turkomania will soon have no choice but to submit to the rod. So the Russians are going straight into independent Tartary. There is a small mention of the Crimean War, just saying that not since the years in which immediately followed the Crimean War has there been seen on the part of the Russian government such a spirit for enterprise with a view to commercial advantages. So it's just talking there about the Crimean War that we're going to be going into again. That involves the Crimean Khanate. We will talk about that at a later date. So I think that's all the information that we need to get from this for now. We've spent quite a bit of time on this, so we're going to move on to the next articles. But just remember, 1873, Khiva was taken. 1875, Kokand was taken. And now this is 1879, and they're saying Bukhara is close, and Samarkand, which they were calling Turkomania. So if we go to our map, 1873, that was taken. 1875, that was taken. This has practically been taken in 1879, and it claimed that Bukhara was not far from falling, and the rest of Turkomania, which is essentially just the name for all this region here. You see, this is the region that's listed as Turkomania, so it's just this south section really, today known as Turkmenistan. Right, finally moving on to the rest of the articles. We're going to try and go chronological with these, so we're going to start in 1812, and we'll move forward in time to I think about 1878. And we'll finish these off today, see what they have to say. So this article, the 1812 one, says Historical Letters to the Editor of the Virginia Argus, Formation of the Kingdoms of Modern Europe after the Fall of the Roman Empire, Asia including Turkey, Arabia, Persia, India and the Tartaries. So as you can see, the article is just talking about different invasions, different empires rising up and the things that they did in Europe. We're going to jump past all of this, and we're going to come first down to here. This is one mention I just noticed, which said, India on this side of the Ganges has been called the Mughal Empire, from the name of the Tartars who subjugated it, and it has also dominated Indostan from the Hindus or Gentus who inhabit it. The Mughal Empire was shattered by Thomas Quli Khan in re-establishing the dethroned prince, left him nothing more than a shadow of power. The present Great Mughal possesses little more than the city of Delhi and the adjacent territories. Interestingly, looking into Thomas Quli Khan, he doesn't have a Wikipedia or anything, but I did find this here, Thomas Quli Khan, Emperor of Persia. Thomas Quli Khan, Emperor of Persia, assassinated in his tent by 5 of his officers, 2 of whom he killed before they could dispatch him. In the description it says, etching of the Emperor of Persia, Tahmasp Quli Khan, also known as Nadir Shah, assassinated by his own officers. And yep, we come to Nadir Shah and Tahmasp Quli Khan. So there he is. It's interesting because obviously it's putting him down as, you know, a Persian or as an Iranian, but it does say that he belonged to the Turkoman Afshars, and as we know, the Turkomans are Tartars. So he is just a different Tartar. But yeah, we see that Nadir idolized Genghis Khan and Timur. So yeah, of course he would, because they are powerful emperors, part of his history. But it's said that he reunited the Iranian realm and removed the invaders. He became so powerful he decided to depose the last members of the dynasty, which had ruled Iran for over 200 years, and became Shah himself in 1736. His numerous campaigns created a great empire that at its maximum extent briefly encompassed what is now part of or includes Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, the North Caucasus, Iraq, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Bahrain, Pakistan, Oman, and the Persian Gulf. Wow. He's been described as the last great Asiatic military conqueror. Nadir was from the semi-nomadic Kurklu clan of the Turkoman Afshar tribe, who migrated from Central Asia to Azerbaijan as a result of the 13th century Mongol invasion, which is Genghis Khan. So this is talking about after how Thomas Quli Khan took over all these states, and now it has devolved that the Mughal Empire is basically now just Delhi and its territories, and most of it is in the possession of the English East India Company. Interestingly, our guy was assassinated apparently by his own officers in his tent in 1747. Well, you'll never guess what. Only 10 years later, the British moved in, and that became the period of British rule known as the British Raj. It didn't become fully official until 1857 with the Indian Rebellion, which we'll get into later. It started in 1757, right after this guy had been killed and the rest of the places were in turmoil. So I do wonder if Britain had something to do with that assassination. Now we come to the Tartaries. The Tartaries are 3 in number. Russian Tartary, which extends from the Volga to Kamchatka. That is this area here, and that's coming all the way from the Volga, which is off the Caspian here. Runs in actually right there, I believe. So the Volga's here, runs all the way up here. So this is Russian Tartary, everywhere between here and here. It is separated from the northwest coast of America by the Bering Straits, which are not very wide and are perpetually obstructed by ice. Tobolsk is the capital. This is talking about the conquest of the Khanate of Siber. So we're talking about these Khanates, and this is Tobolsk. The description says the town was founded on the site of the Tartar town of Bitsik Tura. In 1580, a group of Yermak Timofeyevich's Cossacks initiated the Russian conquest of Siberia, pushing eastwards on behalf of the Tsardom of Russia. After a year of Tartar attacks, Yermak prepared for the conquest of the Khanate of Siber and a campaign to take the Khanate's capital city, Kashlik. So that's talking about Kashlik, which is known as Cumberlich, which is the capital of Tartary at one point. So I'm actually going to use my friend's Twitter thread. He's actually one of the moderators in my, well, he's the only moderator in my Discord. He did this thread, and I'm just going to use this because he has found it. And it says, Tartaria deserta, the capital city is Cumberlich. And if we look at pictures, we can see it right there, and again there. And this lake is important. On the map I showed you from 1721, that's the lake here. It's now called Khan Kisan Lake, or Khan Kisan Lake. I apologize for the quality of this one. I've just used his screenshots, and I don't know where the originals are, and I don't have the time to find them. But this one has it listed as Cyber. You can see Kitty Lake is a similar distance away. You couldn't say it's exactly the same, but it is listed as Cyber. Now, obviously, if you're the Khanate of Cyber, you would probably be in the city of Cyber, so that just makes sense. We know that Cumberlich just means city of the Sham. You can see as well that this Cambalu, Cumberlich, it says, as this diplomat writes, in 1549, the Tartars called their emperor Sham, which means the same thing as prince, and thus Cambalu is the chair of the prince and named so. So when you see up here that there's a Cathay with a Cambalo, that just means exactly the same thing as Cumberlich. It just means that's where the king is, basically, or the prince. That's where the ruler is in this place. Cumberlich, Cambalo, and it's exactly why, if you look up now where Cambalo is, it will tell you that it's Khan Balik in Beijing. And the reason for that is because the Tartars took over Beijing, and they would have called it Khan Balik because when they put a Khan in charge, Pekin, which means city of the king, became Khan Balik, city of the Sham, or court of the prince. So that's how that's been confused. So Beijing is not Cambalu, but it was Khan Balik in a sense. As you can see, my guy talks about it here, saying Sham, Tartar word for prince, related to Khan, the older word for emperor, and Balu, and Balik means seat, court, city in Tartar, and various other Turkic languages. Now, we do disagree on this bit. He says, where are they today? They are disappeared, but Lake Kithay, I disagree on that. I don't think it has disappeared. I think it's become smaller because they put dams in place and it might have been rerouted, but I currently believe that that is a place called Lake Telitskoy. But yeah, so this is Lake Telitskoy, and this is the Obi River. So if you follow this, it takes you all the way up into the Russian territories. This is a very possible candidate for Lake Telitskoy. It's in between Lake Baikal and the Caspian Sea over here. It would be a great location, and on some maps you'll even see it called Lake Altin. Like on this map here from 1700s, a new map of Great Tartary in China, you can see the Obi River coming all the way down to Altin, Lake Altin. So that is presumably Altay, the Lake Telitskoy. And this went into the Mongolian sections of the empire, obviously, which became Chinese Tartary. But back to the article, because that's enough of me diverting to show you where places are. We're not 100% sure, but they apparently destroyed Cyber and then built Tobolsk a few miles downriver, because Tobolsk had been the fort that they'd built to do the attacks on Cyber. If we come to Kashlik, we can actually see that it was the Siberian Tartar fortress in the 16th century, the capital of the Khanate of Cyber. And this talks about in 1582, the troops of this Yermak bloke seizing and ruining Kashlak. The ruined city was then retaken by the Siberian Tartars in 1584, only to be lost forever in 1586. And the nearby city of Tobolsk was founded in 1587. The Khanate of Cyber existed until 1598, when they were completely absorbed into the Russian Empire. This is a depiction of Kashlik. So this is what you can imagine this Siberian Khanate city looked like. But we talked about the Russian Tartary, where that was, and the Tobolsk being the capital. So that makes sense that Tobolsk became the capital if Cyber was the capital before, and Cumbalu, or Cumberlich, sorry, is the name that's given to it because it just means the seat of the prince. So the actual name was Cyber, or the Khanate of Cyber, but it was merely named that after the people. The people would have had their own name, which was called Eskatora in the Siberian Tartar language. Moving on to Chinese Tartary, which includes the Manchu Tartars and the black and yellow Mogui. Titsikar is the capital. So yeah, we've got the Russian Tartary with the capital of Tobolsk, we've got Chinese Tartary with the capital of Titsikar, and independent Tartary is situated between the other two and is environed by China, India and Persia. The inhabitants are chiefly the Kalmuk and the Uzbek Tartars. The principal cities are Samarkand, Bulk, Bukhara, Otra and Tonkat. So this actually says that towards the close of the 12th century, Genghis Khan succeeded his father in the government of several Mughal Tartar hordes to the north of China. By the talents and his courage, he made himself master of everything around him, subdued the nations from the Volga to the Wall of China, and from the peninsula of Korea to the Euphrates. At his death, his empire was divided between his 4 sons, each of whom found himself one of the most powerful monarchs of the earth. The descendants of Genghis were eclipsed of their power by the victories of Tamerlane. We've learnt a lot about Tamerlane on this, but this actually calls him Lima, which I've never seen. So Lima, or Tamerlane, born without inheritance, created for himself an empire more extensive than that of the Macedonian hero Alexander the Great. His conquests included Indostan, Persia, part of Asia, Turkey in Asia, independent and part of Chinese Tartary. He defeated the Turkish Emperor Bayezid on the plains of Angora in Persia in 1402, where a great battle was fought between the two rivals, in which it is said 2 million of men were engaged. The posterity of Timur, like that of Genghis, have sunk beneath the superior fortune and abilities of succeeding princes who sprung up in Asia Minor, in Persia, India and other parts. The Mughal emperor, who died in 1707 at the age of more than 100, was one of his descendants. So once again, what I was talking about, just to show that he took over in the late 1300s, and 1739, one of his descendants is still on the throne. His race, however, had possessed nothing but a nominal authority ever since 1739, when Thomas Quli Khan overturned its authority in India. This Thomas Quli Khan reigned over Persia under the name of Shah Nadir. So once again, linking that together, and as we know, Shah Nadir, or Thomas Quli Khan, was assassinated in 1747 by 5 of his own officers, killing 2 of them, and then in 1757 began the British invasion. So this article is from 1823, provided by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and it's only a small one. It talks about Professor Nevi has been employed by the Emperor of Russia to make researches in the steppes of independent Tartary and to examine the course of the Oxus and the towns of Balkh and Samarkand to prepare invasion plans. Clearly, the expedition will extend perhaps as far as Lake Saisan. Ambassadors have been previously sent to prepare the way in these countries which are so little known, and there is reason to think that at least much geographical knowledge will result from the expedition. Now, obviously, that is 1823, so that is before Russia has invaded independent Tartary. The absolute gall of sending researchers in. Don't worry, we're just having a look around. In 1853, we have the New York Herald, which has a little small article for us down here. Olympius, the son of a Tartar chief and late an officer in the Russian army, has been lecturing at Leicester, England, on the customs, manners and religion of independent Tartary. So this article from 1854, it was talking about the populations, or the non-Russian populations of Russia, and here it speaks about the non-Russian population of European Russia, of which we would speak, would be referable to one of the 3 great families of the human race, to that which ethnologists call Ugnan, but which men at large call Finn, a race akin to the Finlanders. The type of this division is to be found in the north, in the Grand Duchy of Finland. Of the Turkish division, the type is to be found in independent Tartary, and the type of the 3rd division is to be found in the parts between the Baltic and the Black Sea, in Lithuania, Poland, Galicia, Serbia, and C, the infamous country known as C. And it says, in the government of St. Petersburg, the Finns are to be found, and again in those of Archangel and Novgorod. So they're saying that the Finns and the Tartars might have a big connection there, which might make sense because they do talk about the Tartarians actually being the original Vikings. So maybe there is some connection here that we never expected. So this article is talking about the Arabs and Turks and saying they are entirely distinct races of people. The Arabs are descended in part from Ishmael and in part from Jordan. The former call themselves most Arabs and the latter simply Arabs. The name Arab means an inhabitant of the West, Arabia being the west to the rest of Asia. In Europe they were called Saracens, or inhabitants of the East, for the same reason, and in Africa they were called the Moors because they conquered and took possession of Mauritania. Under the name of Saracens, the Arabs, within a comparatively short period after the death of their great prophet, conquered all the Asiatic and African provinces of the Roman Empire and imposed their religion upon the inhabitants. So we saw that with the Barbary coast, the barbarian empire. The Turks, coming afterwards, conquered the same countries and established their own dominion over the Arabs inhabiting them. Hence they are often confounded with them. But the Ottoman Turks are an entirely different race from the Arabs. They come from the banks of the Irtish, at the foot of the Altay Mountains, in the steppes of northern Asia, on the confines of China and Persia. Their original country corresponds in great measure with that which is known at this day as independent Tartary, and is inhabited by Kyrgyzs, Bukharians, Uzbeks, and Turkomans. They were a tribe of Scythian Tartars and were never known to history until the 6th century, whereas the Arabs had preserved their independence for 1,000 years against the kings of Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, and Syria before they were overcome by Alexander the Great. So this is talking about the Ottoman Turks coming from the Altay Mountains. So the region of Altay obviously just being a little bit south of what I was showing you before, that lake, Kithe Lakes or Kitan Lakes, Kisan Lakes, there's lots of names for it. But that, I think, is the lake, the one going into Altay. That's why it's called Alton on that other map that we saw. And it's saying that the Ottomans actually came from here. So is it possible that the Ottoman Empire is actually the Tartarian Empire coming from here? Our next article, we're getting close to the end now, is 1867. I think we've only got a few more to get through, but this one is called The Progress of Russia in Central Asia. So it says, though we are but very imperfectly informed of the advance of the Russians in Central Asia, we know that for several years they have been steadily conquering portions of independent Tartary and annexing them to the Russian dominions. In 1865, the country conquered until that time was constituted a Russian government province under the name of Turkestan. Since then, large additional conquests have been made, and a cable dispatch from St. Petersburg informs us that the country lately conquered has been constituted a new government under the command of General Kaufmann. Now, this is Konstantin Petrovich von Kaufmann. He was the Governor General of Russian Turkestan. He was the general that went in and took over most of it, and he died in 1882. So this is the guy, and I've seen quite a lot of references to him being quite an evil one. His treatment of the Tartars and independent Tartary was nothing less than genocide, apparently. He died at age 64 in Tashkent. And here it gives us the official conquest of Turkestan. At the high point of the Russian conquest of Turkestan in 1867, he became Governor General of the new province of Turkestan and held the post until his death, making himself a name in the expansion of the empire in Central Asia. The western part of the Khanate of Kokand along the Tartaria had already been captured, and the independence of the rest of the country became merely nominal. He accomplished a successful campaign in 1868 against the Emirate of Bukhara. Remember the Emir. So against the Emirate of Bukhara, capturing Samarkand and gradually subjugating the whole country. During the Kievan campaign of 1873, he attacked the Khanate of Khiva, took the capital, and forced the Khan to become a vassal of Russia. This was followed in 1875 by the campaign against Kokand, in which Kaufmann defeated the uprising Khan Nasreddin after an anti-Russian uprising against the previous ruler Khudayar. The fiction of Kokand's independence was ended, and the remaining rump of the Khanate in the Fergana Valley was annexed. This rapid absorption of the Khanates brought Russia into proximity to Afghanistan, and the reception of Kaufmann's emissaries by the Shir Ali Khan was a main cause of the Second Anglo-Afghan War. This next article is 1868, and again it is Russian advances in Asia. The Atlantic Cable has brought the very interesting intelligence that the Russians have recently fought a bloody battle with the army of the Khan of Bukhara, in which the latter was disastrously defeated and the Khan killed. This is an important event. It gives Russia now the whole of independent Tartary, save some very inconsiderable Khanates. Within a few years, the Tsar has conquered Khiva in the northwest and Kokand in the northeast, and now he adds to his vast dominions Bokhara in the south, west of the Caspian Sea, and brings his line almost in contact with that of British India. It says within a few years, the Tsar has conquered Khiva in the northwest and Kokand in the northeast, and now he adds his vast dominions Bokhara. So yes, he's already conquered Khiva and Kokand, and this is apparently in 1868, and now he's killed the Khan of Bokhara. And if we come to the Russian conquest of Central Asia, as they call it, just the Russian conquest of Central Asia, nothing to see here. The belligerents on the right are the Kazakh Khanate, the Bukhara Emirate, the Khiva Khanate, the Kokand Khanate, the Turkmen tribes, the Kyrgyz tribes, Afghanistan, and the British Empire. But the Bukhara till 1868 matches our article. Khiva until 1873 matches our other documents that it fell in 73. Kokand lasting till 76, matches what we saw 75, so 76, 75. But this article does make it sound like they've already been captured. So who knows, maybe those Khans rose up and tried to have a little battle for themselves. But we do know the Khan was killed from Bukhara, apparently. The article talks about the Tsar building a railway which will go from St. Petersburg down to the new areas in Turkestan, which will bring transportation of troops, provisions and arms to that province for the purpose of defensive or offensive war. We do see them building railways to every single one of these places. They take over a place and then they build a railway track to it. What was formerly known as independent Tartary in Central Asia contained the three cities of Khiva, Bukhara and Kokand, with the Sea of Aral in its centre. The intended invasion of Kokand in 1863 was deferred on account of the Polish insurrection. The plan, however, was carried out the next year in the capture of Turkestan and Avliata. The Great Battle of Vichtar, fought on the banks of the Juxartes, or Tartaria, in May 1866, opened the way to a series of Russian victories which have established the military power of the empire in the entire country north of the Juxartes, from the Celestial Mountains to the Sea of Aral, and placed a Christian force in the heart of Turan. The battles of Samarkand, Khojend and Tashkent and the fall of Kimkand have been followed by the fall of Bukhara, the crowning triumph of the Russian military prowess in Central Asia. So yeah, we will come back and read this article again at the beginning of the next video. I'll read the whole thing, but for now that's all we needed to see. The next article is rather small. It's just Russian progress in Asia from 1868. The Atlantic Cable informs us of a further advance of Russian power in Central Asia. The Kingdom or Khanate of Bukhara, the most powerful state of what used to be called independent Tartary, has been subjugated by the armies of the Tsar. The city of Bukhara, the capital, and the more ancient city of Samarkand, once the capital of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, have been captured, giving to Russia the entire control of the valley of the Juxartes, whose headwaters mingle with those of the Indus. The single province or Khanate of Kunduz, about 150 miles across with 46,000 square miles of mountain and marsh, is all that now lies between the territories of Russia and the Punjab, the northwestern province of British India. Another from 1868, this says, the Russians do not mean to abandon their recent conquests in Central Asia, as has several times been reported. None of the important towns of Bukhara which have been occupied will be evacuated, and the army will at once receive large reinforcements. Russia has only the alternative in the Central Asian question to leave the whole of that country to the sole influence of Great Britain by bringing it under Russian rule. None of the independent countries, which is between Russia, China, India and Persia, possess any vitality and all must sooner or later fall a prey to either Russia or England. It also says that the English have seemed to have made up their mind not to dispute to the Russians any part of independent Tartary, but in return they demand that Russia leave Afghanistan to the exclusive protection of England. I like that they call it protection. This point Russia will probably refuse to concede, and thus Afghanistan may be the first bone of contention between the two formidable rivals. From the New York Herald in 1869 we have, the Russian government intends establishing commercial depots in Upper Tartary, which declared its independence from China 3 years ago. So in 1866, Upper Tartary declared independence from China. So in 1873 from St. Petersburg, Khiva is taken. The imperialist Russian troops from Tashkent and Fort No. 1, after their concentration in the Balkan Hills, marched direct across the Kizilkum Desert, east of Lake Aral in the centre of independent Tartary, to the banks of the lower Oxus. This from the 1873 edition of the New York Herald gives us the seat of the war in Central Asia, a map showing the routes of the various Russian columns in the invasion and capture of Khiva. So if this is something that you are interested by, perhaps you should come find this article and go more into that, and you can have a look at the way that they supposedly moved. It seems that they came down this way, moving through what became Turkestan and down into Bukhara, Khiva, Kokand, as you can see, and Tashkent over here. And you can see the desert is now called the Karakum Desert. Another 1873 New York Herald. So the New York Herald really was giving us the information, wasn't it, about independent Tartary? Was any of it true, or was it altered? You tell me. But this just says, a dispatch from London informs us that since the fall of Khiva, the government of Russia has renewed its assurances that its troops will be withdrawn from the country when the Khan has been sufficiently punished for his barbarous treatment of Russian subjects. Assuming that this information is correct, these assurances are intended to allay the apprehensions of England touching the designs of Russia underlying this conquest of Khiva. It gives to Russia, in connection with previous military occupations in those regions, absolute control over the whole of the vast section of Central Asia known as Turkestan or independent Tartary. the area of which is 792,000 square miles, or equal to about 17 times the area of the state of New York. All this vast country is now absolutely at the mercy of Russia, including the Khanates or kingdoms of Bukhara, Kunduz, Kokand and Khiva, and the Kyrgyz steppes or deserts, bordering on and partly occupied by Russia. Her authority is thus extended to the western frontier of the Chinese Empire, to the northwestern mountain barriers of British India, and to the eastern flank of Persia. This one coming from 1874 in the Portland Daily Press. Campaigning on the Oxus and the fall of Khiva. We hardly expected to find a finished book from a newspaper correspondent, but the subject was so striking and interesting that we entered upon its perusal with much interest. Independent Tartary was almost an unknown land until Vanbury's adventurous journey, disguised as a dervish at imminent peril to himself, made us familiar with it. Old legends of the conquests of Genghis Khan and Timur had given a charm of wonder to that mysterious country. The admirable romance, the adventures of a Quzilbash, founded on the conquest of Nadir Shah, over which we pored in childhood, has thrilled us with admiration for the wild unconquerable Turkomans and the campaigning of Alexander the Great, with the fact that their race still holds sway over Constantinople, lent a historical interest to the people who have finally yielded to the arms of Russia. So this is talking about how the people in the 1800s, they seem to have heard tales of Nadir Shah and Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, and obviously Nadir Shah is that one we heard about before, Thomas Kuli Khan. That Alexander the Great is also a Tartar, a Turkoman, which is Tartar. So he's claiming that Alexander the Great is from the same yoke as Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, and that's interesting, isn't it? And obviously claiming that the fact that their race still holds sway over Constantinople, which many people will argue is the original Jerusalem, but that's a conversation for another day. This article makes some big claims. It's from 1875, again, the Portland Daily Press. It does seem to be only a few select newspapers that even know about independent Tartary, and they do like to print about it. But maybe that's just a limitation of our archival access. But looking at this article, we have a mention here. It's talking actually about Aryans, and we will talk more about that at another point as well. Well, I think we'll jump in at this point. Rome was 1500s year in the far future, Troy not to be founded for 500 years to come, although we now learn from recent explorations among its ruins that the Trojans were of this same Aryan race. The region from which the people came seems to have been independent Tartary, whence the tide of invasion has intermittently burst out in all ages, and yet has ever been maintained at its own freedom, sometimes crushed but never submitting. Now that is big, because if the Trojans were Aryans from independent Tartary, well, the Trojans, after the fall of Troy, moved to Britain with Brutus. According to this, the Trojans are from independent Tartary, which would mean they were Tartars. So, supposedly, after the fall of Troy in 650 BC, they chilled for a little bit, and then about 500 BC, they boarded some boats at Lemnos. The remainders of these people, who were known as the tribes, because the tribes of Israel were with them, they were known as unstoppable hordes, sounds a lot like the Tartars, and they moved to Britain. So it's quite possible that the British are actually, well, not all of us, but most of us will be the descendants of the Aryan Tartars of Troy. Incredible. This article from 1876 from The Sun in New York, it talks about the conquest of Kokand. Russia has just annihilated one of the three great khanates of Central Asia. The word khanate, meaning a country under the rule of a khan, is a peculiar term of political geography applied in modern times almost exclusively to the three principal states of the region which was best known 20 years ago as independent Tartary, but is now more familiar under the name of Western Turkestan. In their order from west to east, these states are Khiva, Bukhara and Kokand. Russia's steady advance eastward since the Crimean War dismembered them, but did not destroy them, and although each was shorn of rich territory to be incorporated with the Russian Empire, each preserved a nominal independence up to the last summer. Kokand, the easternmost of the khanates, is the first to be absolutely absorbed, with the classic province of Fergana as its nucleus. It is an oval valley in the upper basin of the ancient Jaxartes, favoured with a mild climate and a productive soil. On the east it rises to the great plateau of Pamir, the roof of the world, and on the south the mountainous ridges of Karategin separate it from Wakhan and Badakhshan, the northern dependencies of Afghanistan. 10 years ago, the Russians annexed the western part of Kokand, including the celebrated city of Tashkent, while eastern Kokand, comprising the lovely Vale of Andijan, with the town of that name, was left intact under the rule of Kuda Yar Khan, who was so unpopular with the Kipchak tribe as to be largely dependent upon Russia for the maintenance of his throne. He is the son-in-law of the Emir of Bukhara, and though himself an Uzbek Tartar, represented the Kyrgyz faction in Kokand politics as opposed to the Kipchaks. But the Kipchaks were famous warriors of old, when Babur conquered Hindustan and when Tamerlane ruled the Eastern world. They seem to have regained their ancient character for bravery, and last summer they rose against the Khan and his Russian superiors. So this talks more and more about the Russians moving through the Tartars, quite a lot to read, so if you'd like us to come back and go through some more of this on the next episode, I think we might do. From the same year of 1876, we see Russia is advancing towards India and the British Lion is uneasy, not to say scared. Russia has lately absorbed the Khanate of Kokand, one of the great states of independent Tartary, and Gorchakov's stomach is about as good as Bismarck's. Undoubtedly, says the New York Sun, this causes some uneasiness to English statesmen. It must hasten the adoption of a definite and logical policy in regard to Russia's Asiatic frontier. Shall England protect India by maintaining an intermediate zone of independent states, of which Afghanistan is the most important? Or shall she boldly advance her own outposts and occupy the great Afghan fortresses of Herat? So yeah, that's basically talking, once again, they're stoking up some fear about whether Russia is going to take India from the British. And I think as well, it's quite important to note that only a few newspapers are the ones giving this information out. So realistically, if you were someone alive at those times, you know, you're getting all this information from these people. You don't know what the names are. They could have changed it. They could make people sound like barbarians, etc. when they're not. Make them sound like, you know, uncivilized people without great cities, but we've seen the cities. We know that they're actually a lot better than you'd be led to believe by these tribes and khanates. But we'll move on to the final article now. Yeah, this is from 1878, and we can see conquests in Central Asia. The 4 cities on the line of march were Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara and Balkh. They are situated in the vast region formerly known as Independent Tartary and now called West Turkestan. It comprises the Khanates of Khiva, Kokand and Bukhara, a southern tier of small Khanates, and finally Balkh. The Russian advance eastward and southward in Central Asia began early in the present century. 40 years ago, Persia had surrendered 70,000 square miles of territory and the Tartars 270,000 square miles. And within 20 years, the conquest of Khiva and Kokand has been completed, and Bukhara has been brought under Russian influence. The line of conquest did not begin on the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea, but led from Orenburg to the Sea of Aral, and thence along the banks of Tartaria. During the reign of Nicholas, a chain of trading posts and military stations were established on the river in the direction of Tashkent, Fort Perovsky being the strongest link. A military commission reported in 1851 that it was absolutely necessary to unite the new outpost line on that river with the advanced posts on the Siberian frontier. After the Crimean War, this plan was carried into execution. In 1864, the city of Turkestan was captured, and in the following year, the frontier was extended beyond Tashkent. The Khans of Kokand and Bukhara, by their constant assaults upon the outposts, exposed themselves to a formidable campaign in 1868, when Samarkand surrendered to the Russian arms. The Khan of Bukhara was defeated in a battle and forced to sign a treaty of peace by which he acknowledged the right of the invaders to retain all that they had conquered. The Khanate of Khiva was not invaded until 1873, when an army was sent out in 2 main divisions, one advancing from Turkestan on the east and another from Orenburg and the Caucasus on the west. The Turkestan column was under the orders of General Kaufmann, which we saw before, and the line of march led across the steppes. The Khivans were defeated in several skirmishes and forced to abandon their capital. The Khan signed a treaty of peace by which a heavy indemnity was imposed, and territorial cessions were made by which the entire east coast of the Caspian Sea was brought under the dominion of the northern power. In 1875, a revolution occurred in Kokand, and the conquest of the Khanate was completed. So yeah, once again, that article just goes quite in depth into exactly what Russia was doing. So guys, that is finally the end of the Tartaria in the News series. All the articles from the Library of Congress that were worth viewing to do with Tartaria, Tartary, the Empire, etc. Although if you can find any for yourself that I haven't shown that you'd like me to see, make sure you drop them in the comments and I'll be sure to include them in a follow-up video at some point in the future. But once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Ancient Historia.